Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. We are very pleased to welcome you all to the OU Economic Seminar Series. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in economics, and I'm very pleased to chair today this event on green finance, energy transition, and geopolitical crisis in Eurasia and beyond. So there is no much need for this explaining why and the relevance of this talk, but we all know that there is a mix of climate crisis, the pandemic, financial volatility, price volatility, and both trade and real wars are exposing many countries, businesses, and households to rising costs for both heating and production. So the energy crisis questions the sustainability of our economic system in producing, financing, and trading the goods necessary for people's livelihood. So these talks, so both Basani and Olena's talk, focus from different perspectives on the financial constraints, geopolitical barriers, and risks of energy production, distribution, and a just energy transition. So we will explore different dimensions of this huge topic. So in 1.5 hours, so we will be good food for thoughts and reflections, and then we will have a Q&A at the end. So we are delighted to host these two distinguished speakers, Olena Borodyna, based at ODI, Overseas Development Institute in UK, to be joined by Dr. Basani Baloyi, the Climate, Energy and Infrastructure Program lead at the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa. They, as I said, will provide two different interesting perspectives, one on the more geopolitical and just green transition in Eurasia, and one more on the financing options that we have, with a little bit of examples also coming from the South African example. So Olena Borodyna is a senior transition risk analyst in the Global Risks and Resilience Program at ODI. Her work spans advisory on the risk and strategies for managing geopolitical and low-carbon transition in the context of climate change and other threats. ESG and political risk management of investments in emerging and developing economies, and China geostrategy. She has experience delivering multi-country research projects and policy advisor to corporate and public sector clients, having previously worked in business intelligence as for a renewable energy company. In her role as policy advisor, she supported the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and Department for Transport with the development of standards and business model for low-carbon hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels through advisory services. She holds a master in geopolitics, territory and security from King's College London and a bachelor in Chinese and history from SOAS, University of London. Olena is fluent in Mandarin Chinese, Ukrainian and Russian, and conversational Spanish. She's studying towards Sustainability and Climate Risk Certificate and the Global Association of Risk Professionals. So very impressive background, Olena, and thank you for joining again. And then we have our own Basani Baloyi, who is the Climate, Energy and Infrastructure Program lead at the Institute of Economic Justice in South Africa. She's a feminist, development economist and activist. She gained her research experience while working on industrial policy issues in academia at the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development and the Corporate Strategy and Industrial Development Unit. She's a former inequality program lead at Oxfam South Africa, where she infused her research and management experience with movement building and coordination, campaigning and advocating for economic and social justice in partnership with social movements. Dr. Baloyi is the former director of industrial policy and acting chief director in the industrial procurement unit at the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa. She holds a PhD in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies and a master in public policy and MCon in economics from Wits University. As a former drama student and child actress, Dr. Baloyi is a fierce passion for the arts and is in constant pursuit of using that artistic background in her advocacy work for social change. So very, very, very happy to have both of you, and thanks again for having accepted our invitation. So without further ado, we'll then start with Olena and Olena, and we'll then followed by Basani's presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A. So please, Olena, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorena, for the introduction, and lovely to be here on the panel with you and Basani, and thank you for inviting me this afternoon. I will apologize in advance in case there is a problem with my internet. It has been going on and off in the last couple of days, but I will be back if there are any issues. So I think my background is in geopolitics, and I've been looking at energy security more so over the last couple of years, and my work is focused specifically around in Central Asia, in China, but also more so in Eastern Europe. So I think I'm bringing the Eurasia perspective, but also happy to answer the questions on the beyond as well. So I will start with by talking a little bit about the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine war and why we should care and why it's relevant to the energy transition before talking a little bit more about the findings from our work in Central Asia on opportunities and some of the challenges for the green transition, and especially in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think that with the Russia-Ukraine war dragging into the winter, its geopolitical consequences are becoming ever clearer. So earlier this year, we saw Russia using Europe's energy dependency on gas for blackmail. And we are now seeing that it's targeting critical Ukrainian infrastructure ahead of winter. I don't know if many of people here have experienced Eastern European winters. They are quite different to what we have here in the UK. Ukrainian winters are much colder. So Russia's move is really intended to undermine the country's resilience, social, political, and economic in what is a critical period. But what I think it also does is highlight the critical role of energy to our economies, our well-being, and our ability to function really as modern societies, and why energy security is a critical component of national security frameworks, not only here in Europe, but pretty much for any other country that looks at national security, for example, China. And I know that this is not headline news to anyone who's attending this event, but I think it's critical to bear that in mind because energy security cannot be taken for granted. And for many countries, including those in the region that I'm working on, but also many other developing countries, energy security is an ongoing issue and is a priority for their development. So while our focus today is on energy systems, what I would like to highlight that's coming out of our work and analysis is that the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war go beyond energy supplies and energy demand and prices, but also food systems. So some of the more tangible impacts. But what the war has also done is create cascading shocks across systems, which are in turn affecting energy transition because they impact the political, socioeconomic, and business environment for countries that are pursuing and should be more pursuing green transition more actively. So one of the systems, I suppose, is a more straightforward one, peace and security. We have taken our peace and security arrangements in Europe for granted for a long time. But beyond Europe and Russia and Ukraine, we're also seeing conflict flashpoints in the Caucasus and Central Asia, which can undermine the countries in the region ability and willingness to cooperate on some of the energy security issues in their respective regions. But beyond peace and security systems, if we take organized crime systems, for example, there are risks around changing commodity flows, and by that we mean arms, narcotic flows. And why it matters is because the influx and changes to those flows can affect countries through which those laws are going through, and impact corruption and other relevant political risk indicators, which in turn affect the business environment, including that for investment in renewable energy. Along the financial pathways, earlier this year, my colleagues at ODI in our International Economic Development Group have looked at which low and middle income countries have most direct exposure to the Russia-Ukraine war and were most vulnerable to the war. Because global shocks like the Russia-Ukraine war can undermine their growth and economic transformation, but also impact their political stability and appetite and scope for crucial reforms in the energy sector. And what they found was that countries with most direct exposure through trade, migration, and other pathways were all former Soviet Union countries. So the top three were Belarus, Armenia, and Kyrgyz Republic. But Uzbekistan and Tajikistan were among top 7 countries, and as was Mongolia and Moldova. And when they combined direct and indirect economic exposure and looked at economic resilience as well, top 3 countries that are most vulnerable to the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war were Belarus, Armenia, and Kyrgyz Republic, with Uzbekistan in top 7, Tajikistan in top 15. Now, why does it matter that those 3 countries are among most exposed and vulnerable to the Russia-Ukraine war, and how is it relevant to the energy sector? We have conducted 2 pieces of research that were looking at management of climate risks in those 3 countries, as well as opportunities and co-benefits of them transitioning to green energy systems. What we found is that all 3 countries are already experiencing climate change impacts, but overall, despite their high potential for non-conventional renewables like solar, wind, and hydropower, their potential is underutilized in all the 3 study countries. And as part of the same project, when we looked at opportunities and co-benefits of transitioning, we looked at the energy systems, and the hydropower contributes most to energy supplies for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. For Uzbekistan, that is natural gas. But for all 3 countries, energy security was an issue, particularly for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which suffered from electricity shortages during winter. And they're also vulnerable to seasonal changes in water supply. But for Uzbekistan, the challenge was more around increasing their emissions because of their over-reliance on natural gas. These 3 countries also have outdated energy infrastructure, which means that they experience disruptions, and system losses. And across the 3 countries, state-owned energy companies were failing to recover their production costs. And low tariffs, uncollected payments, theft, outdated infrastructure, you name it, has all contributed to their losses. Now, there are opportunities for these countries to benefit from renewable energy transition. And there are some really good graphs which show their potential for both solar and wind, which unfortunately I don't have handy at the moment because our report is not published yet. But I'll be happy to share the report with those interested once it is published in the next 2 weeks. So the 3 countries have a lot of potential, and the opportunities span beyond their energy systems. So it can help the countries meet their climate goals, it can create new jobs, and it can improve health outcomes because it will help alleviate some of the pollution and in turn save them on healthcare costs. But in terms of energy systems, if the 3 countries were to capitalize on their renewable energy potential, they can increase their energy security and diversify their supplies because energy production has become more renewable energy production, I should highlight, has become more cost competitive in the 3 countries. And there are investment and financing opportunities that they can harness. Overall, the 3 countries have an opportunity there to increase their resilience of their energy infrastructure, provided that this new renewables infrastructure is built in a resilient way, because climate risks affect not only fossil fuel infrastructure and other sectors, it will also impact renewables energy infrastructure. And again, if there are people who are interested in understanding more about this, I'm happy to share our upcoming study, and it will be published in the next 2 weeks. So renewable energy infrastructure can increase the resilience of energy systems in the 3 countries, but it has to be built in a resilient way that is that accounts for climate risks and disaster risks. But for the 2 of the countries in our study, there are opportunities for energy trade with renewables, because they have an opportunity to increase not only their generation capacity, but also meet internal demand, but also increase energy exports. And that has been challenging in the region ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. But despite all of these opportunities, there are a lot of challenges, and I'm sure some of the people attending this seminar will be familiar with them, because the region has a lot of socioeconomic challenges and political challenges. I would probably say that number 1 is reforming energy tariffs to increase the cost competitiveness of the renewable energy, but it is a huge political issue, as we're seeing time and time again. I think from Kazakhstan to France, we know that increasing fuel and energy cost is a very challenging political task, and leaders across the 3 countries in our study would be mindful of that. But as a result of the economic shocks from the Russia-Ukraine war, which are coming on the back of COVID-19, it can make it even more challenging to raise prices and revise energy tariffs, because the leaders will be so mindful of the social and political challenges that brings. Other challenges are more around the regulatory side, and providing the right business environment for renewable energy producers. But regional cooperation under CASA 1000, for example, is also is already fraught with challenges, but can be made even more challenging because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So overall, what we're seeing is that these countries are not where they can be in terms of their energy transition, and geopolitical shocks are making it ever more difficult for them to be doing so. I think that's where I shall stop. I know it was a whiz tour, but I'm keen to take questions, and happy to discuss in more detail towards the end.
Thank you very much. That was great. I have a question about the resilient way in which you said that countries, especially Eurasian and Central Asian countries, should the opportunities in which they should invest into green just transition. And I mean, obviously the governance structure might be a point, but I was wondering whether you had you could expand a little bit more on the material condition, or what are the conditions through which countries should create this resiliency, because it's a very overloaded term, and sometimes I struggle to grasp the meaning.
Yes, absolutely. I think I should clarify that in the case of energy infrastructure resilience, we're talking about integrating climate risk management, disaster risk management into that infrastructure, into the design of that infrastructure, and as that infrastructure is running. So it is related to the governance system, but it doesn't talk about, I'm not necessarily talking about the resilience of the countries themselves, which is a very broad term, and there are a lot of components which go into that. I think Basani is just joining. Yes. So in the case of infrastructure, for example, it would mean conducting. Oh, hello.
Yes. Hi, Basani. Yes, we're just ending one question, and Jonkul, I see that you have a question. Yeah, can you hear us? And can
Hello? Yes, I can hear you guys now.
Yes, great. So we'll just, hold the questions for Olena. I can see that Jonkul and Steph had 2 questions already, but we'll move on to the Basani's presentation now that we have her with us, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A and continue the conversation. Thanks a lot. All right, so I'll share the screen. and Basani's slides.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to talk on this panel and about these issues. So this presentation is based on work that my colleague and I, Jezri Krinsky, have been doing on following South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, which I'll speak to shortly. And so basically, this is some perspectives that we have, some critical perspectives that we have on this climate financing deal. So the purpose of this presentation is to first explain the implications of de-risking climate financing regime, a de-risking climate financing regime through the use of blended finance and public-private partnerships in energy generation. And public-private partnerships being independent power producers being a form of public-private partnerships in the renewable sector in South Africa. So looking at how the implications of de-risking on the just energy transition, using the just energy transition partnership climate deal as a case study. And second is to outline possible climate financing pathways that may support a just energy transition, but also their associated risks. So the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a climate financing deal that has been entered into between the governments of South Africa and a set of global north countries, including the EU, to mobilize finance in support of South Africa's decarbonization strategy. Already about $8.5 billion have been committed by this group. As you can see, and this is from an investment plan that was released about 2 Fridays ago, civil society has been lobbying for an open process, and it was only released in the eve of COP that we got to see these numbers. But as you can tell, is that the major sources of financing are loans, about 81%, the bulk of which is concessional loans. Okay, and then grants occupy 4% of the committed finance. So the financing is being targeted mostly at the electricity infrastructure, which enjoys about 89.4% of committed just energy transition finance, with a focus on private provisioning of energy. Over the near term, this will be in the form of an accelerated rollout of independent power producers, right? And those are a form of public-private partnership that are within the renewable sector, and whose merits I will get to later. But it's important to say that only 0.3% of committed JETP finance is targeted towards economic diversification and innovation, and 0.1% of committed JETP finance is targeted towards skills development. And these numbers are quite key in mapping out the justice component of the JETP. So there are 4 critical concerns that the IEJ has with the JETP financing. First of all is that it prioritizes private sector profit opportunities on infrastructure, all the while the state assumes the risk. Second is that it worsens the fiscal conditions as independent power producers lock Eskom, which is our state utility company, into expensive forms of provisioning. Third, it exacerbates energy poverty. And the fourth is that it will perpetuate what has been a particular structure of the economy in South Africa, that is the minerals energy complex, which is basically a set of industries that are based within the mining and energy and related industrial sectors as well as finance, and these have been a core form of system of accumulation within the South African economy, having a lot of political influence in public policy as well. So we talk about how this will perpetuate the minerals energy finance complex by disincentivizing the industrialization of the renewable industry, which is necessary for decent work creation. So we argue basically that an energy transition framed through the current lens of the JETP is really unlikely to be just. So in tackling the first provocation, which is around the private accumulation through de-risking, independent power producers are highly leveraged assets, right? With debt to equity ratios that average about 80% debt to 20% equity on average to produce about 5 gigawatts of energy, which is more than Eskom at 44 gigawatts, right? Some IPPs have even higher leverage of 95% debt to 5% equity. The private sector project owners apply measures to de-risk this risk exposure, right? This high leverage, right? By first financing their projects through off-balance sheet financing, meaning they create separate entities that are not listed in the stock exchange and thus don't report their financial statements publicly, and they make these entities absorb the debt and the risks and rewards associated with the project. And then private finance is also de-risked by mobilizing public money through mechanisms such as, first through blended finance, which combines public finance like concessional loans and grants with private finance. And the presence of public finance at concessional rates or even at grants at no interest reduces the cost of finance for private finance. Second, they also de-risk through demand guarantees that are instruments that oblige the state utility, Eskom, to pay a set revenue to the IPP throughout the lifetime of the contract, right? And then third, the contract lock-ins that force Eskom to pay the set guarantee over a long period of normally 20 years, right? And these contracts are inflexible and result in heavy penalties should Eskom not afford to honor them, right? So with the risks significantly reduced, and once the IPP is now its utility, right? The private sector is then free to extract revenue streams that can accrue in, let's say, year 15, in the seventh year of the infrastructure's operation by refinancing the loan and also reselling the shares of the IPP in secondary markets to make more money, right? Therefore, the rewards are privatized while the risks are social through long lock-in contracts, demand guarantees, various blended financing, and sometimes the use of state-backed guarantees, which currently have been dropped within this current financing package in the IPP sector. So until recently, independent power producers required state-backed guarantees. That is a guarantee that the state will be able to pay the loan obligations should the need arise, right? On the loans mobilized by the private sector for them to be bankable, profitable. The private provisioning of energy, as you can see from the table, needs about 5 times more backing than Eskom under a bid window 1 to 4. Now, what these bid windows are is like a set of auctions over a period of time, and so there have been 4 that this where state-backed guarantees have been used since 2010. So with each round, there have been state-backed guarantees that have been used, and basically IPPs require 5 more times of state backing than actually Eskom does. And in line with this, so it is welcome that the JET IP appears to move away from these state-backed guarantees in its program, in its renewable program. However, this is only for future IPPs, right? So in bid window 5 and in successive auctions, right? So the JET IP makes, the investment plan makes no mention of the reduction or removal of state-backed guarantees in the current renewable IPPs under bid window 1 to 4, choosing only to focus on mechanisms to reduce Eskom's state-backed guarantees. So such a reduction in state-backed guarantees for bid window 1 to 4 would require that the state enter into renegotiations with those IPPs, right? So that the state can implement a considered and sustainable solution to managing this public liability. However, previous attempts by the state to renegotiate contract terms to manage Eskom's fragility, financial fragility, were thwarted by the IPP sector's threats of court action. So this implies that the status quo of high state exposure to IPP state-backed guarantees will remain, with the risk borne by the state and the profit basically reaped by those IPPs under that bid window 1 to 4. So it has been cheaper to produce energy due to the falling price of renewables at successive bid windows. So basically, this figure over here shows you how the price of different renewable technologies have fallen after each bid window round. So from bid window 1 to bid window 4. Demand guarantee lock-ins of early bid rounds prevent the benefits of current cheaper market prices. So if we are, let's say, in bid window 3, those IPPs that were under bid window 1 or bid window 2 will not, because of demand guarantees, they'll charge the same price that they originally charged, or that is they contracted for. They will not adjust the price to the new current price, right? And Eskom CEO, Mr. De Ruyter, and the Public Enterprise Minister Gordhan proposed a renegotiation of bid window 1 and 2, which were highly subsidized by the feed-in tariffs. But the private sector, empowered by extremely costly lock-ins clauses, threatened court action. And these lock-ins give the IPPs a sort of monopoly position where they are less subject to competitive pressures once they've been built and once they are operating. And this inflexibility serves to then deepen Eskom's fiscal fragility. Now, the JET IP frames energy poverty as a grid access issue in the manner in which that the committed financing is allocated, right? And it neglects that energy poverty in South Africa is actually an issue around affordability. 80% of South Africans have access to the grid, right? But the way in which the funding is allocated doesn't take into consideration that, energy poverty is actually an affordability issue, right? So still, the JET IP focuses also on cost-reflective tariffs to support the privatized energy system that is envisioned. And cost-reflective tariff structures under a privatized regime are not cost-reflective tariffs under a public sector kind of regime. I think that is far more of a cost reflective tariff. Under a privatized regime, they would be more honestly called a cost plus interest from the debt and the loans, plus profit, right, which is the return on investment tariff structure, because the rates of profits that are present within the tariff are naturalized and then hidden as costs. And this is necessary to guarantee the revenue streams that the state has promised the private sector in these offtake agreements, right, or demand guarantees. Therefore, heavy reliance on private finance could produce pressure to increase user fees. So of the 319 billion rand that has been targeted for catalytic investments for municipalities by the JET-IP, only 0.2 billion is targeted towards knowledge generation or research models for cross-subsidization. So there isn't really money that is being put on the table for cross-subsidization. Much of that is in the form of just researching about it. Therefore, the JET-IP does not make investment commitments to substantively support a social policy in South Africa called the free basic electricity subsidy, where poor households are subsidized a particular portion for their energy use. And so, this will be needed when embedded generation or self-generation of energy, which is financed by this JET-IP, comes on stream. Because how will rich, the cross-subsidization helps the rich. You take from the rich and you give to the poor, basically. But through this financing, where we are not committing financing towards cross-subsidization, nor are we committing financing towards this free basic electricity subsidy, then we are not seeing this cross-subsidization taking place as we privatize our energy system, especially because the tariff system, which is meant to be cost reflective, now actually includes returns, to investment for the private sector, which will increase the tariffs. So this is an issue around the justice component of this deal. So the job creation potential in the renewable energy value chain will be in the renewable energy manufacturing sector, amongst others, and not necessarily, which is far more capital intensive, right? And there will be a need for a balance between adequate investment in energy infrastructure to ensure, in a way that ensures energy access, and also adequate renewable energy manufacturing investment for job creation and decent work, right? But the JET-IP apportions about 1.6 billion to the localization of the clean value chain, clean energy value chain, and the JET-IP that is targeted by this financing to the electricity infrastructure, right? And so the imbalance will continue the dominance of South Africa's existing growth path, which I explained to be this minerals energy finance complex, which is not a job creator, right? And so robust industrial financing that supports, the industrialization of the renewable energy value chain is a necessary counterweight to the short-term price increases that are associated with the development of the sector. So without the cheap financing that the renewable energy generation sector is receiving to make it competitive, then the renewable energy manufacturing sector will falter, because the IPP sector will continue to resist industrial policy measures that impact the cost competitiveness of inputs into the renewable energy generation, because their objective is to maximize profit at least cost, no matter the developmental implications of that. So, so a just energy transition financing pathway must ensure that climate and environmental policy are supported by industrial policy and social policy and an appropriate financial resource mobilization strategy. So there are a couple of pathways we kind of like speak about, right? Some we like more than others for obvious reasons. The one we least like is the first, which is basically to say, okay, so we live in a world where IPPs exist. How do we ensure that we can regulate these things so that an appropriate risk return sharing scheme is met to benefit both the public interest and the private, if at all, right? So some measures that could be in place are to ensure that contracts are made public, these entities are removed from are not opaque structures anymore, and they are, they are out, they are made public for oversight and risk management. That there are life cycle cost comparisons between public-private partnerships and public provisioning to aid decision making, so we are indeed getting the least cost option. Currently, the investment plan has barred Eskom from undertaking any renewable energy. It is only going to be the private sector that does so. So basically, you are not getting this cost comparison of a public provision versus a private kind of provision. Improvement of state negotiation capacity and capability, empowered by a policy framework that does not allow them to enter into contracts that generate fragility. The investment plan currently basically wants to liberalize even further the policy environment to make IPPs to accelerate them even further, right? So we are going back, and then also ensuring that a robust localization policy is enforced. Now, the risk here is that to enforce such terms, you are set up against a global financial architecture that has prioritized minimizing private sector risk exposure and maximizing profit opportunity. And this global financial architecture includes, the Bretton Woods institutions, financial institutions, and so they are invested in de-risking in a way that basically, the state is made weakened in this whole process, right? And another risk is that it requires a strong state that can discipline the private sector and not be captured by vested interests from the banking and IPP sectors to direct state policy to line their pockets to the detriment of a just energy transition. Now, a second pathway is debt cancellation and reparations for climate justice as a public pathway energy system. So the second is, okay, we can still build a public pathway to a renewable energy system. This would require the cancellation of the World Bank's odious debt that we incurred, and climate reparations owed by corporations in global north countries to the global south, and the dominance of grants over loans, and the wider creation of the redistribution of special drawing rights from surplus global north countries to deficit global south countries. And the risk, however, is that this requires a fair and just multilateral climate financing regime, which currently is quite weak. Moreover, the problematic multilateral climate finance regime that we do have will further be weakened by bilateral climate financing deals such as this JETP, because a deal that is that with one country brokering a deal with 5 powerful countries may look different to a deal that is brokered between 152 developing countries versus 37 developed countries, as an example. Now, the final pathway is what Katie Kedward and Daniel Gabor and others have called an allocative green credit pathway, and this is taken basically from their work in a paper that they've published called Aligning Finance with the Green Transition. From risk-based to allocative green credit policy. And they draw on the experience of East Asian tigers to develop their economies using policies that integrate financial, monetary, fiscal, and industrial policy to ensure that finance is directed towards productive investment that can catalyze development, so that the dynamics of private allocation do not undermine the overall developmental strategic objectives of the state. So integrated with environmental policies, these allocative green credit policies are central to directing investment towards sustainable, productive investments to ensure a just energy transition, or a green transition for more broadly. This kind of pathway would be suitable to developing countries such as South Africa that have these well-developed financial capital markets, banking system, institutional investors. And basically what you're doing there is that you are using incentives or coercion to direct finance towards particular ends that using incentives and also to not direct it towards green ends as well. So yeah, I'll just, but of course there are risks to that. There's, the global financial architecture, the economic orthodoxy of our Reserve Bank that would be against such things, our national treasury, and also, thank you very much. I will leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you, Basani. It was really great. And I think it complements perfectly, the other presentation by Olena, because you had, you looked at two different contexts of so-called emerging markets on transition economies with very sensitive geopolitical and different geopolitical challenges, but that both kind of trying to create the perfect or the ideal financial and industrial environment to fulfill the objective of green transition and just green transition. So we have just about 30 minutes for Q&A. So we will just go back to the questions, and I already know that we have a couple of questions for Olena, and then so the one on the resilience, then we have John Cole that asked about would the eventual end of the Russian-Ukrainian war raise the prospect of global energy prices falling back, and perhaps thus creating an opportunity to impose carbon taxes that partially offset some of the market price fall? Another question was, what does the past history of the region suggest will be the likely outcomes, if history tells us anything? And we'll just we'll ask also a question. We have Ayora asking a question about Basani. What do you think is the likelihood acceptability by large institutions of debt cancellation for countries to be able to fund the energy transition? So maybe we'll just try to reply to those. And then Susan, I know that has a question, and please raise your hands if you have further questions. We'll just start with this round of questions, and then we'll go. We start again with another round. Yes, please, Olena.
Well, thank you. And I also wanted to go back a little bit to the point that we picked up earlier on risk management. So by resilient infrastructure, we mean infrastructure that integrates, that has better disaster risk management and all hazards risk assessments. So in that case, it was what I was talking about, resilient infrastructure, it was just limited to that. And I'll be happy to share our upcoming research with you, so you have the context for this work. So I think I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to tackle the first question on the energy prices, just because I don't understand enough about the global energy price dynamics. But in terms of the second question on the history of the region and what that means for likely outcomes, I think I understand we're talking about the geopolitical outcomes in the region, and I think what we're seeing there is quite interesting right now, because for 30 years in Central Asia, for example, countries have been maintaining their relations with Russia, some to a much greater extent than others. So I'm really sorry. I think I'll have to get that bell. Because they'll just knock in.
Yeah, we have, but we can continue with Olena later, and then maybe I will collect Susan's question, which I guess will be addressed by Basani and will be for Basani. So Susan, do you want to speak so that Basani can answer both the question from Ayora about the reparation and your question?
Yeah, sure. I'm very predictable. Thanks, Lorena. Yeah, Basani, thanks. Thanks so much for that presentation. It's really exciting and just intricate and kind of interconnected stuff. So I have a question, but I was just also interested to know whether you're planning to write this up in a sort of academic way, particularly as a contribution to the MEC discussions, debates and development. That's not really the question. The question I have really is about the MEC or the MEFC. And, as you know, energy was really, and as you said, energy was actually central to the way in which the MEC developed, particularly in relation to industrial policy and strategy in South Africa. And I just want to know whether, it's very clear how the MEC conditions what's happening now, but could the centrality of energy also be something that could support more radical change? Is there anything about the MEC that you think actually, the specific nature of the political economy of South Africa and role of energy, is there any way that you can see that as providing some kind of supportive structure? Sorry, it's a bit of a random question.
Yeah, no,
it's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, can I add one question specific to that, and then we'll go back to Olena. But first, let's discuss this. But I have a question for Basani. I think your presentation was great. I have a question for you about exactly that. So one first question is about this idea of the energy mineral complex and how it can create industrialization through forward and backward linkages. And so how can we think of energy-rich countries to create, multipliers effect in terms of employment creation, industrialization, innovation in that sense, and whether South Africa, I know that there has been some works on plastic, of whether there is an ongoing discussion or just it's basically very similar to Susan's questions. And the second question is because, for instance, in the Eurasian and Central Asian countries, what happened in the renewable energy sector, in particular to solar, is that there is a huge import of those technologies, coming from China, for instance. So how do we, why are we, it's a genuine question. Are we assuming that the creation of an industry and a production and manufacturing of renewable energy will automatically bring, industrialization, jobs creation, and manufacturing production, and create, sustain industrializations? It's a question I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's just that because in Central Asia, the issue is that Chinese solars technologies are just floating in the market.
So thank you guys for your questions. Sorry, thank you for your questions. Okay, the first question on the likelihood of debt cancellation. Look, I think I am perhaps more optimistic now, given, you know, the Bridgetown agenda that the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley of Barbados has basically initiated, which is an agenda that seeks to link climate and development issues together in a way that supports the global South. And basically that pathway is of debt cancellation is dependent upon the global South's organizing over this issue, right? Using whatever like multilateral institutions they are, or you know, to do so, or even forging their own type, where they can renegotiate this term, these terms, right? And sort of a new debt, like a new debt jubilee based on like climate reparations. So it is positive that certain steps are being taken, but then it really requires the momentum of political leadership to within the global South to ensure that this actually transpires. It's easier on the public debt side than it is on private debt restructuring. And so that will be interesting to follow. So I'm hopeful, but I don't know. I don't have a ball. What is it? Like I can't tell the fortunes of you know what I mean, of what may and may not happen. But it's just to say that. In terms of an academic paper, Susan, so we've produced a policy brief that lays out these things that we are talking about, but it's not academic, obviously. The intention of that paper is basically to inform key constituencies within the labor movement and civil society, who basically have been excluded from this deal. You know, finance is just this opaque thing for them, yet it has such big implications on the justice components. You know, thousands of workers will be laid off as a result of this, and so we need it. The financing package becomes critical in locating how these workers will be absorbed into a green like energy system, right? And so basically the intention was to lay out these arguments so that as they engage with public policy, they are able to do so. But you're right, I do think that these ideas also belong, a greater intervention is required within academia on this thing. Thanks for giving me the idea. I'm going to talk to my colleague Jesri, and what you've given me is homework over December, and I hate you for it. To write such a paper, and then both you and Lorena, your interventions around, you know, the MEC is central in conditioning all these this whole disarticulated, you know, development path that we are in. In what ways do we see it being radical, especially the energy system? I think if we take ourselves back, you know, like at the turn of the century, the 20th century, our energy system was basically in private hands, with mining companies producing for themselves and whatnot. And then came the visionary of Van der Bijl, who basically was like, no, we need to nationalize this entity because we see it as a key form of industrial development, right? The energy system is there for industrial development. But of course, it's around industrial development on a fossil fuel based kind of energy system, and industrial development for whom, right? And at the time, industrial development was to accommodate a particular race class dynamic, right? And so this energy system has to be democratized, right? It can no longer, we can no longer continue with it in ways that it has been developed, and now with IPPs, it's going to basically lose also its national identity, with a lot of foreign companies that will be part of forming our energy system, and therefore loosening our ability to actually set it up on a development path, on a sustainable development path, which is far more inclusive. So yes, indeed, it is problematic, but you will know, Susan, sorry, maybe I'm carrying on more than I should, but the MEC is not just a set of what can I say? The MEC is not just a set of sectors, right? It's also a political power, in a sense, that brokers policy and to its own benefit, right? So as part of the radicalizing of the energy system, there is a need for democratizing that, to loosen that grip that particular part of the economy has in dictating policy, such that we can actually have downstream sustainable localization, right? And that is a change in the balance of forces along that value chain, right? Yeah, so I'll pause there. I hope guys, Lorena and Susan, I've answered your question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Basani. And Olena, maybe you want to follow up on the pre-bell.
Yeah, sorry
and
about
if
that.
you want to comment and have questions also for Basani, I mean, feel free to.
I have a related question to the one that you had on solar production, because that's one of the questions that I'm interested in from a geopolitical and energy dependence point of view. But I'll go back to the question on Central Asia. I think the kind of Central Asia we will see emerging after the Russia-Ukraine war is going to look different. And that is because for the last 30 years, I think there has been a status quo in terms of relations with Russia, in terms of where the power dynamics lie. I think that is now beginning to change because, well, Russian army is not performing very well in the war. That is for a number of reasons, but I think that for Central Asia, Russia was important for economic and security reasons. The security angle is probably not there. Because we're seeing how limited the protection could be. In terms of economic benefits, if Russia were to plunge deeper into the economic recession, I'm actually not sure if it has experienced economic recession after the war. But if economic situation was to deteriorate and the economic exposure was to grow, I think that is a good incentive for Central Asian countries to diversify. But I think more importantly, it's also the change in national consciousness. I'm very cautious about using those words, but I do think that we're seeing changes in national identities, particularly in places like Kazakhstan, where there is a strong sense of national identity which has emerged over the last 30 years. And Kazakhstan has become a lot more assertive in its relationship with Russia, and I think other states are going to follow that. China is also China's role in the region, and Turkey's role in the region is also one to watch, because China had a lot of issues in Central Asia around the Belt and Road, around the risk discussion. I know that because we have done a study on that, I think around the time when there were quite a lot of studies going on the risks of the Belt and Road. But we're seeing China re-emerging into Central Asia, and I think that is a relationship to watch. There are also other actors like UAE, which are playing a role in renewable energy infrastructure, which are quite interesting to watch, because there is the Islamic link there. And I don't know much about the role of Islamic finance, for example, but is that an interesting source of financing for renewable energy transition to explore for Central Asia and to build on those links? I don't know yet, but an interesting one to watch. I also had a question around the industrialization aspect, because I think there are a lot of assumptions being made that if we can just produce our own energy through renewable energy, we will be okay and we will be energy independent, which is of course not the case, because we will need to import solar panels from somewhere unless we can produce them. We need the raw materials to produce those. So I think perhaps the question here in the UK is a little bit different to the ones in some of the emerging economies. But the question is, is there scope for energy dependence on other countries through different pathways, and is that a missed opportunity as well for those countries to industrialize? I don't know enough about the topic, but from an energy independence point of view, it would make sense to bring in more production closer to home, I think. And then I think I answered both questions. I don't know if there is an outstanding question. There is one on nuclear energy. Sorry, I'll answer that one and then move on. I saw it in the chat. So I think that we haven't seen much investment into nuclear energy going into the 3 countries which we looked at. I believe Uzbekistan is building a nuclear power plant, but that won't go live in the next 8 years or so. I think Kyrgyzstan was planning to build a small nuclear plant with Russia, but I'm not sure how well that's going as well. So I don't think there's anything substantial at the moment. And I don't know much about Kazakhstan, but I think that if there were nuclear energy in Central Asia, Kazakhstan would be the one leading the way.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Sorry, I didn't. It doesn't automatically pop up in my chat box. But yeah, very relevant question about nuclear. So we can have a few minutes for the last rounds of questions. I can see Christina raise her hands. Hi, Christina, and please, anyone who wants to, this is the last opportunity.
Thanks to both speakers for their very stimulating talks. It was a great pleasure. I have a sort of follow-up question to Olena. Just going on from the last point you were just making about energy independence and sort of false promises around that. I was wondering, to what degree do you think this idea of a just transition or sort of reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, kind of at what cost is that going to happen? Or should, sorry, let me try and rephrase that question a bit better. There's obviously an urgency to move away from fossil fuels, and there's at what cost are countries willing to do that in terms of sort of seeing I guess, a similar military-industrial complex in the hands of a private, corporatized, marketized sector doing that being problematic in lines of what Basani was mentioning about the need to democratize certain parts of the economy. So what I'm wondering is whether, in your view, this movement towards clean energy may or may not contain similar problems to the way that the economy is run at the moment. I hope that's kind of clear. I'm not sure I can make it more specific, but I'd like to hear your views about that.
Maybe like you mean like political cost and economic cost and like multi-dimensional kind of cost, I guess.
Or even just environmental cost, like land grabs for solar panels, or sort of the vagaries of green capitalism, green colonialism.
I think that's a great question, and actually one that I've been thinking about myself, and one that we're looking at, because and I think it's one where I have to be very careful in explaining my position, because when we are transitioning to clean energy, I think we need to be realistic about the other risks that it may create, especially because we might see, well, we are not seeing, but we might see a rush to secure minerals. We might see a rush to secure land for solar panels. And if we are going to be doing that in countries where the rule of law systems are not are not working in a way that they should be, then it does create further social risks and political risks, and that transition is not going to be just. But also in terms of outsourcing environmental costs, I think that's a really great question, because to produce all of these, to mine all of those minerals, we will need to be mining a lot more. And I think we will need to be transitioning to clean energy as we are facing other threats. And one of them is, of course, land degradation. Another is biodiversity loss. So the question is, at what cost are we going to be mining our way to clean energy? I don't have an answer to that question, but that is a question that we are asking, for example, and how do we do so in a risk-informed way, and in a way that countries can support their own development priorities and manage other threats to their environment, for example. I haven't looked at any studies, for example, that match the two and look at the biodiversity risk of clean energy transition, because of where the minerals are going to be coming from and what we can do to mitigate those risks. But I think it's a question we should be asking. Sorry, I know that doesn't answer your question.
No, that's super helpful, and it's very kind of interesting to hear that it's something that's been on your mind as well. I think one of the sort of difficulties that's kind of coming up at the moment is that the way that risk will be managed is pricing it. So the idea that in order to protect biodiversity, you'd have to price it, and then and all of these kind of things. So you kind of exacerbate a sort of tendency of commodifying nature, and nature as an asset class, and all of this kind of things. So I'm not sure whether there's any stop to that process that you can see.
I think that's one of the things that I sort of struggle with a little bit myself, because we work a lot with policymakers, we work a lot with other stakeholders, and it seems like pricing nature is the way that things are going, to give nature any value. What we can do to stop it, I don't know. I have my own philosophical issues with that, personal issues with that. I don't know if I can think of another way of doing it, to give it some value in a way that brings it to the attention of markets, and where we can see more nature positive investments. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, Christina, as I said, there is a book recently published about, I think it's The Price of a Whale, that tries to unpack and unpick this kind of the commodification pressures. Like, even if we do renewable, I mean, they're not neutral. They have to, I mean, if they're still embedded in the marketization, but the value of a whale, exactly. Thanks, Christina. So very nice to have that with the very, very open question, unsolved question, but that's why we need more research and discussion, both interdisciplinary discussion, and I'm really glad that Olena came from her background of higher geopolitical knowledge, and very pragmatic and also detailed examples coming from the South African case of Basani. Thank you for showing us your results, and we look forward both the policy brief that I think is already published from Basani, and Olena's report, and also Basani, your academic article. Now you have this task assigned. But I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I'll just thank everyone for attending and for participating. Has been a great discussion, and Christina maybe wants to end no? Okay, so we'll just look forward to join you for the next. Join us for the next seminar in December about the UBI, and the tags are on there. There has been some actually paperworks and material posted by IORA on the link between biodiversity risk and acquisition and the book, if you're interested to apply this discussion to more scientific knowledge. And thank you very much again, and speak soon, and enjoy the rest of the evening, and bye from rainy London.